Republicans need to leave in 55 minutes, so if you just kind of drag this out, the Democrats to make all the decisions.
Okay, I can do that.
We'll fix one before.
I was gonna say, we're done.
Family in my town has some legacy acres, so they get enough of their fault.
Okay, so
Lucky them.
yeah. I've got an old version of this book from Thursday.
I thought the entire tax classification thing had been stripped. But I just heard from them that some of it survived.
It was taken from 9 to 4.
Yeah. Dramatically reduced.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think the misunderstanding was that there was an amendment on the floor in the House that did a study in the short term, but it didn't take anything out. And so the way that they report on it seems like makes it sound like that the classifications aren't in there, but that's
Just can't trust Digger or I'm right now. So jokes.
if anyone wants to practice, they're amazing. Okay, that's the commission. We still got.
If you can trust Digger for the draw the wrath of Digger.
Can't you believe the secretary showed us? What page are you starting?
66, I think.
56?
66.
66.
Yeah, we're going way into the bill and I have about 60 pages myself.
Okay, well, I only have up to about 50.
Well, it's perfect. You'll be entirely reliant on what I
I
say.
will be entirely reliant.
I
So
like
much for last Thursday.
I like that.
version of this bill. I will have to kill a few more trees if I'm gonna make notes on it. All right,
You guys got some.
so let's start.
Look at some plans.
Yeah.
Perfect. Can you say that?
Can you up here admit?
Yeah, I know. Okay. The drawbacks, here we go.
Don't want me to.
Share your screen and off we go.
All right, John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Jumping back into page 454. And now we are jumping past the education policy sections to the education funding, the education finance sections. I'll give you at each reader assistance heading, I can give you like a high level overview of what you're about to see. And then I can hit the sections hopefully relatively quickly. Just once you've had that high level overview, I think it's going to be the more helpful thing at this point. So state funding of public education, this general section, which goes through section 45, amends Title 16, Chapter 133, to move from our current education funding system to a foundation formula. And it does that by creating a base per pupil amount of roughly $50,000, and educational opportunity payment for each school district, which is the aggregate amount that a school district receives, reflective of all of its students, including the different needs they have as recognized by weighting factors, and creating new ways for economic disadvantage, English language learners, and special education. You'll see some conforming changes throughout, and I can hopefully just skip over those relatively quickly, but I will call them out. It replaces the existing weights for small or sparse schools with support grants for small schools and for sparse schools. Cleans up some language related to the Ed Fund and the stabilization reserve. Moves to a vote for supplemental district spending. You may recall Chair Kornheiser talking about this, that the local spending is the supplemental district spending. So moving to a vote for that supplemental district spending in place of the existing school budget vote, including updating the ballot language, and by creating a reserve to catch any extra funds that are raised at the local level, resulting from equalization of taxing capacity through that supplemental district spending tax. So with that, I will jump into the actual changes in law. So you're going to see on this, we're on page 66, a bunch of struck language removing existing education funding concepts that are no longer necessary. You're going to see just a cleanup change here. This is not substantive, this base education amount, the categorical base amount. This is very old provisions in Title 16 that date back to at least, I think this actual provision is 2003, but the numbers around this date back to at least Act 60. And this is just something that hasn't been addressed yet. You'll recall that Chair Kornheiser was describing how there are many provisions of education policy that remain to be settled. And so this is just a cleanup change because it starts with the word base. Don't want people to confuse this with the base amount.
What page are you on now?
67, bottom of page 67.
Thank you.
So these are your new foundation formula figures. So your base amount is a per pupil cost factor amount of 15,033, and that's adjusted for inflation. I think you guys are familiar with the cost factor concept, but basically this figure that's generated is meant to be reflective of what current costs for delivery of education services are. And as you'll see with the inflator, this would be inflated from the year 2025 through whatever fiscal year the amount is going to
And
determine.
then 1533 is the governor's number.
No, this is from Dr. Colby's memo. So
This is-
all of the numbers that you will see relates to the
Yeah.
base, and the weighting factors are drawn from Dr. Colby's presentation earlier this April. So just a
So
few.
that is above.
That is,
I thought it was.
I think I want to say the admin was like 15.5 or something like
That's what
that,
I thought, okay.
but it had different weights. So the
Okay.
actual amount that you have
Well,
per
you're gonna
people
have
would
this more,
be.
all right.
We don't need to talk about the inflator, but I just want to call out, it is adjusted from fiscal year 2025 because that figure is chosen. So you'll need to adjust for inflation from the year that it's selected. You may recall as well, and I'll hit on this again later, but there's a provision built into Title 16 to ensure recalibration, all of these figures. And that's actually going to happen as currently proposed in January of next year. So you would immediately revisit this base amount and the weighting factors. Educational opportunity payment, this is just your aggregate amount that a school district receives. So it's your base amount multiplied by the school district's weighted long-term membership. And I do just want to stress this weighted long-term membership. So what you're getting is an aggregate amount for a school district that reflects educationally meaningful distinctions among students. That accounts for English language learning, accounts for special education, accounts for all of those distinctions in the EOP that a school district receives. Section 35 creates the new weights. In many cases, this uses existing weights, but with additional refinements. And so what you see here, and we are on the bottom of page 68. For special education, the term that's used in Title 16, Chapter 101 is child with a disability. And so that's being picked up here. And then we're calling out different categories of disabilities. And these will be used to determine different weights because different disabilities are associated with different weights. So we don't have to walk through, unless you're particularly interested, the sets of disabilities that are identified here. What's helpful to know is just they're categorized into 3 buckets, and those produce different weights. And again, these are all consistent with Dr. Colby's memo as presented earlier this month. For English language learners, we do have an additional refinement. So this is beyond what's in current law to account for proficiency levels. So what assessed level are pupils at? That's going to produce different weights. So that's why you're seeing a definition here for English proficiency level. And it's using a standardized measure of academic language proficiency that Vermont is part of this consortium. Additionally, English language learners can receive another weight on top of whatever proficiency level weight they receive. And that's this newcomer or SLIFE, which is a pupil identified as New American or a student with limited or interrupted formal education, which are, as I understand it, technical terms within the English language learner space. I would not be able to say off the top of my head what New American means, but I understand this to be a term within that space.
Did I hear you say we do not currently weight? This is all new, the proficiency level?
That's correct. The way I would describe this is it like existing law, it makes a distinction for English language learners, but what you have here are refinements. So instead of having one weight for just English language learners, you'll have a different set of weights based on how they're assessed, like whatever level they happen to be in. So if they're at the lowest level of English language proficiency, they would receive a greater weight because you would expect more funds to be required to educate someone at that level. So it's consistent with the structure of the kinds of categories that Vermont has been focused on, plus refinements within those categories, like English language proficiency within that category.
Okay, and the newcomer
Mhm.
would be someone that comes here from a refugee camp in Rwanda, I know. Or Nigeria, I mean,
I don't know my understanding is that it's a technical term within the English language learner space. I can come back with more information on
so
newcomer fits.
for people who teach English as a second language, these are categories they use.
Yes, these are
We're putting
recognized.
them into law.
Exactly. We are not creating, like, we haven't invented the thing newcomer or
Right.
slide. We haven't invented these English language proficiency levels. We're just pulling them into the weights that are used here.
And saying that we will weight differently.
Exactly.
If you speak English as well as I do, you're probably not going to get much of a weight.
Makes sense to me.
All right.
It would be interesting if
Or maybe you'll get a
These
bit.
definitions.
for the, so if you pull up if you see the WIDA, the WIDA, you can find that consortium online, which lists the different levels. It'll be level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can see the actual, it's called the access test for
And
somebody.
newcomer's life is defined there.
Newcomer's life is not defined outside of this. We don't have an additional definition as to what New American is. That's something I could come back and speak to. My understanding is it is something within the English language space. So folks who work in this area are familiar with this term, but I don't personally know. And I do think for SLIFE, the term is provided there. That's a student with limited or interrupted formal education, which is again,
Many
I
of
see.
the Afghan refugees that we have in this area do not know how to read or write. They have had basically no formal education. So along with learning a brand new language and a brand new culture, they also are having to learn to read things like stop signs so they can get a
Well, I
driver's
was just thinking whether
license.
New American is, say, somebody from Quebec.
Can I speak to that?
Well, depending on how much French they speak.
Would you mind? Thank you so much. I did just want to flag to the committee that there's an Office of New Americans bill that passed the Senate. It's going to the House. There is a committee that is going to work on what it would look like. And part of their charge is to define New American. So we will potentially have the definition for that term next year.
Mhm.
Just one, because you're right, we don't have a specific.
And that's why I'm just questioning it in my mind when I think of providing a incremental amount of money to give to someone that we haven't defined. That,
Right.
Well, I think these terms, as John had said, are defined within the context of English language learning. Curriculum and standards and federal programs, for English language learners. That's my understanding of that. Newcomer and SLIFE have a definition for within that context, and that's how Professor Colby knew how much to assign the weight to because of the cost for those.
yeah, so I'm just looking for a reference that I can read
Yeah.
Yep.
in English.
And when I drop these in, I just pulled the categories directly from her. But that makes sense. The actual process for determining your counts is much the same as it works under existing law, but you're just updating for the new category. So what you see here is the removal of counts for grade levels, because Dr. Colby's memo did not propose distinguishing among grade levels for purposes of weighting. So you don't need to have the counts for those if you accept this set of weighting factors.
Just doing away with the high school differential essentially.
Exactly, each of these three distinctions. And then this is your economic disadvantage weight. So families that are below 150%, 185% of federal poverty level and using this. So this is familiar from existing law. Nothing new to that section other than organization. But the new changes you see for your English language learners This pulls in the refinements for your assessment at an English language proficiency level. Level 1, you'll see that some of these levels are grouped together in terms of the cost that they require, that cost factor weighted. So two or three are treated as the same cost factor. 5 or 6 are also treated as the same cost factor. And then you'll see that you count separately pupils that are identified as newcomers like, because that's eligible for an additional weight. So you can be an English language learner that receives both a level 1 proficiency level weight, plus you could receive a newcomer weight. So you could receive both of those weights. For special education, you see the counts based on the categorization of a child's particular disability. So category A, B, or C, and those are those categories we talked about above. The only technical thing that you'll see here is that if the child has multiple disabilities, they would be grouped in that category C, which is your highest cost or your highest weighting factor. You're seeing struck language here for sparse school districts. And similarly, you're seeing struck language for small schools. And the reason for that is that the weights for sparse and small schools have been removed and replaced with support grants, which we'll come to in a separate section. Skip past this existing law provision and then jump down to the actual determination of WLTM. It's the same as the way it works under existing law. For each category, the secretary computes the weighting count by using long-term membership that they've just assigned to each individual category. And then you're going to see the actual weights that are set out in this section. So for your economic disadvantage, a dip from 1.03 to 1.02. I will call out that the weights in existing law function in a structure where they operate to maneuver tax capacity, whereas the weights proposed under this system are foundation formula weights that produce additional dollars that follow a student. So I think it's sort of coincidental that these happen to align pretty closely. You can see in descending order the different weights provided based on the English language proficiency level. So if you're at this level 1, the low level, you're receiving a weight of 2.11. And if you're at one of these higher levels, level 5 or 6, you're receiving a weight of 0.12. And you can see, again, the point I was making earlier, that if the English language learner is a newcomer or SLIFE included in that long-term membership, they receive an additional weighting amount of 0.42. And that can be on top of any English language proficiency level weight that they've received.
And that accounts for the fact that they have no uninterrupted formal education.
Yep. In
Probably
all,
translates, they don't read or write or do arithmetic very well.
I think the easy is to just, as you go through the section, remind yourself that it's cost factor, and it will be intuitive why you're receiving particular weights for, I mean, you may not be able to produce another off your head, but it will make sense as to why you have descending or increasing amounts. Here's your special education weights. So each child with a disability, including long-term membership, to receive an additional weighting amount based on categorization. And you can see 0.79 for category A, 1.89 for category B. And I think this is your highest weight for that category C disability, 2.49. And again, all of these are additive. Basically, if you're trying to figure out for an individual student, which is not typically the way you would do this, typically this is at the school district level, but if you're trying to figure out for your kid, you would take the base amount and you would multiply it by 1 plus the sum of all of the weights that they have. And that would give you a dollar figure that tells you what the foundation formula as weighted is saying is the appropriate amount of money to follow that student.
How does this kind of interplay with Act 173, where we have census block grants for special education?
So this repeals the census block grant, and it does retain the extraordinary reimbursement measures for special education. Yes. And then there's going to be
Wait.
Yep, exactly. So this is the new way to replace the census block grants. That's a good question, and I should note in some of the sections you didn't hear Beth speak about. There is a proposed study coming back on special education. I think that's this December. We have a pretty good plan. So yeah, all of the provision, the way that I think about the bill is it's trying to get core structural features in place and then recognizing this is a huge amount of policy to move. And so there's going to be a bunch of reports that come back on pieces that are incredibly important, special education, pre-K, adult education and the like, but just recognizing time constraints. So those are meant to be efforts for next legislative session.
Okay.
you're going to see that we no longer have a purposeful education spending concept because we pulled out that concept of education spending. And so what is being replaced with is the determination of a school district's educational opportunity payment. Again, that's that aggregate figure. The Secretary of Education determines this by multiplying a school district's weighted long-term membership by the base, and they will have calculated that weighted long-term membership under this section, which is why this subsection is included here. The recalibration piece that I spoke to, and we're on page 70. This is the recalibration subsection. It's in your weighting section, Title 16, section 4010.
76.
Yes, I'm sorry, did I say 70? Yeah, page 76. Thank you. And this is asking for updates to weights, the base amount, and transportation reimbursement. Your weights and your base amount are the things that are tweaked when we talk about a cost factor or an evidence-based model. It's moving those numbers. It's not changing the structural features of the foundation formula.
The price of gasoline or replacement tires
So,
quadruple your transportation
right.
would have to go on.
You could have pieces like that. The other things that is helpful to call out in this context is that there are other mechanisms for the numbers to be effective beyond recalibration and beyond you guys sitting down and changing them, which is inflation. So whatever inflationary measure is chosen is going to matter. And inflationary measure is going to be chosen based on the basket of items that compose the index that is the basis for inflation. So if you build into, or if you capture in your inflationary measures, things like healthcare costs or the like, you can help build in a mechanism that automatically adjusts your figures to reflect any changes in those costs. So, and we'll come to sections later, but there's going to be a report. Well, you're hearing me say a million times. There will be a report from JFO on inflationary measures.
I'm sorry. What was the logic of having them all recalculated next year?
Yeah. It's a good question because we have them right now.
Yeah.
I was my personal read was just like a read of the room, like people feeling like we just got the Dr. Colby memo at the beginning of April, and this thing had to pass out of the House, last Friday. So I think part of it was like, this may be good, but just recognizing time constraints, like let's double check these figures and make sure that they are right. They are supported by Dr. Colby's work, but let's just be doubly sure that this is what we're
You
saying.
also don't know what inflation's
Yeah.
gonna do.
Right, but then it goes every 5 years after that.
Exactly.
So
This is starting.
26, then the first one, the next one would be 31.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is just making, the other way to think about this is throughout the whole multi-year process to move to a foundation formula, folks are naturally going to re-examine these numbers anyway. So I also sort of think even if you didn't include this recalibration, it's likely to happen next session anyway.
It just seems like we would do it in 28 instead of 26, because we would do
Like
it
the immediate.
the year before.
Yeah.
Just to refresh them and then start.
Sure.
So that it seems weird to me to do it there.
I'm trying to think of when folks start building their budgets, because they will start building budgets before the foundation formula is in effect.
Yeah.
They will be anticipating.
It's usually
that foundation.
September before.
Yeah,
So-
I
Okay.
would think, there's nothing here says we can't do it more often.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
So if they start building budgets and it starts coming out like we can't do this, I'm sure we will be asked to make alterations. This is our best, or the house's best shot at this point with what we know. But I think we all know that there are many things in flux that could change the entire economic picture. And we will have to react and act appropriately.
And
Yeah,
yeah, depending on your perspective, this is either a happy or an upsetting fact, but you have years to keep doing this. So thanks, John. I'm here too. Okay, section 36. I would describe some of these sections as while they do have substantive effects, you can think of these as natural flow through changes of moving to the foundation formula. So this is the section that provides that the legislature will appropriate funds to pay for education, and we're just updating to pick up your educational opportunity payment and any supplemental district spending, which is that locally raised amount that will flow up to the ed fund, and your support grants. So this is conforming changes, as I would describe it, to capture all the definitional changes we made above.
And this is probably where we're gonna spend the most time, because we've got to figure out where we're going to get the money to do that.
Yeah, so when we come to Title 32, I think that's going to be the big place. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can go quickly through this. Annually, each school district to receive its EOP and a dollar amount equal to its supplemental district spending. You can see we've removed some technical provisions that are no longer necessary. We don't have to distinguish for unorganized towns or GORs. I will say implicit in the bill is a vision of what the school districts will be. Obviously, we don't know what the boundaries will be, but the thinking is that larger school
Nobody's
districts are
gonna absorb
exactly.
the GORs.
Or just that you don't need to distinguish
Yeah.
the amounts that they receive per pupil because everyone's receiving a foundation amount, right? And it's just tracking the students, and that would go to the district as a whole. It wouldn't have to go to the core or town itself. Cleanup provisions related to what's included in town reports. We no longer have the concept of purposeful education spending, so that's been stripped. More substantively, and we are now on page 79. Section 37 is your new small schools and sparse school districts support grants. I'll just call out why you see a definition section that includes enrollment here, where we've been talking about long-term membership, weighted long-term membership. Those are concepts that only apply at the district level. So when we talk about a school, we can't talk about long-term membership. We have to talk about enrollment. And so that's why you see a defined term for enrollment. This matches the definition of enrollment that was used for the small school support grant. So this is not a new concept. This is just which students were enrolled in the school on October 1 and counts full and part-time equally as one.
No GO students, right?
Yeah.
You weren't here, but the way we had it set up, schools were given extra students if you were a small school, and then the next year you got more, but we never did away with the two you got. So some schools ended up with a whole lot of GO students that they were getting paid for, but never existed. So this seems to continue the preventing that.
Yeah, it's meant to track actual bodies in
Yes.
the schools.
Actual bodies.
For the definition of small school, there are two important pieces of this. So one is the intuitive part, fewer than 100 pupils and 2-year average enrollment. But the second piece is that earlier in the bill, in the section, I think it's section 6, maybe, there is tasking the State Board of Education with determining standards for what a school that is small by necessity is. So this definition of small school would pick up under standards consistent with whatever the State Board determines that small by necessity piece. Part of why I draw this out, aside from you need to know this information because that's what the definition is also that you will not see language here to say that a small school has to fall within a sparse school district, I think, which is what you may be familiar with from existing law. But the way that that might make it into this concept is we're waiting to hear what the State Board comes back with on what small by necessity is. And that may be part of your determination. Sparse school district, intuitive concept, school district where the number of persons per square mile as of July 1 is fewer than 55 persons. It is at the district level. And you can imagine that in a much larger school district, you might end up with different effects than you might expect, like areas you might see as particularly rural. If they are grouped in a district with a heavily populated area, then they might not end up being a sparse school district. So just something to call out. This is a characteristic at the district level. And just think about what that means when you're thinking about different school district boundaries. Intuitive concept for 2-year average enrollment of the 2 most recently completed school years. I wish they were all that. Small school support grant. And these figures are drawn from the Dr. Colby memo. So annually, the secretary to pay a small school support grant to each school district for each small school. And again, it pulls in that State Board determination of small by necessity in an amount determined by multiplying the 2-year average enrollment in the small school by 3,157. So that's essentially a per pupil amount, is what you're getting for your small school support grant. You also may be eligible for a sparsity support grant, and that's to each sparse school district in an amount determined by multiplying the 2-year average enrollment of each public school in the school district by 1,954. So this is getting at public schools that are operating within the district. They're not sending sparsity support grants broadly to every student that is within that sparse school district. They're sending it in the amount of enrollment in the public schools in the sparse school district, if that makes sense. So if someone was tuitioning their kids out to another district, you wouldn't receive a sparsity support grant to follow essentially that student that's being tuitioned out. That's some of the logic behind this.
Could you get both?
You could get both.
Small
You could get
school
both.
within a sparse district.
Exactly. You could get both. Yep.
And you could have a bunch of small schools within a sparse district and get a whole lot.
Theoretically, yeah.
This doesn't seem to incentivize right sizing the.
Yeah.
This does not address that piece. That would, I would like, from a policy perspective, that would need to come from elsewhere. Yeah, this is accepting, and this goes back to the cost factor piece. The Dr. Colby memo is about costs under the current environment, right? It's not an evidence-based approach. As we'll get to at the end of my sections, there's a period that contemplates a transition to an evidence-based approach. And if particular conditions are triggered, then you might then move to this evidence-based approach. And at that point, you might not need the grants anymore. It just depends. But this is reflecting how Vermont currently operates, basically. Yep. And just to note, you're going to see inflationary adjustment provisions throughout my sections. They're all going to look exactly the same. They're just going to call out this NEPA inflator. And what we've tried to do is in any sections where a dollar figure is called out to fill in inflationary measures so that you don't have to revisit these in future years to correct for them. But just note that you will receive a report back in December that actually talks about what the best inflationary or recommendations or considerations for inflationary measures. And you may land on this, but you may also land on something else. Section 38 is conforming changes for the Ed Fund. So as you know, it picks up revenue paid from the statewide education tax, but it's also going to pick up revenue paid to the state from the supplemental district spending tax, which will come to. As I'll talk about when we get to that section, this is different from the administration's proposal, where dollars that were raised locally do not flow up, they stay locally. Under this proposal, all revenue flows up to the state and goes back down to the districts, and that will make more sense once I talk about recapture and the supplemental district spending yield and a couple of other things, including a reserve. This language you see struck here, we've talked before about the PTC repeal, and this sentence is just removing the provisions that allow for payments out of the Ed Fund for the PTC, because you're repealing that, you no longer need to make payments out of the Ed Fund for that property tax credit, which is where it's currently done. 39, this is entirely cleanups. There's not really anything to see here. This is section 4026, which speaks to the stabilization reserve within the Ed Fund. It has some archaic language here, which references its enactment. This is not a substantive change, so not much to talk about there. And again, section 4028, this is similar to the education payment section that we talked about before. These are some low changes from moving to the foundation formula, using the same payment schedule as exists under the current system, and switching from that education spending payment to your BOP and your supplemental district spending. The substantive change that you do see here on the top of page 83 is that under existing law, we have a provision to say that if districts haven't adopted a budget by 30 days before the date of payment, they're not eligible for the full amount that they would receive. So they receive a reduced amount if they're delayed in passing their budget. You're going to see throughout the bill, any incentive measures for passing budgets have been pulled out, because the thinking is you're just in a different world now. We currently have reasons to incentivize the passage of budgets to get at statewide funds that are raised. Because the budget is now supplemental and is raised entirely locally, you don't necessarily have to incentivize those
The
cities.
budget is how you spend the money that the state mentioned. So we don't need their budget to set the amount
Exactly.
we're setting.
Exactly. This, you can determine your statewide education tax rate without knowing what anyone's rates are.
Crux of what we're doing right now, we're considering.
Yes,
So pretty big, pretty big piece. You'll see we maintain provisions for payments for special ed, CTE, categorical grants. These may be revisited next year as updates are made. And this is archaic language. This is actually referencing excess spending, what is still called high spending. And we no longer have the concept of excess spending, which will be made clear once we get to Title 32. So those provisions have been struck. Section 43 is your updated ballot language for your budgets. You no longer need a budget for your base amount, right? Because that's just going to be your COP. You're just going to receive that, your base amount multiplied by your weighted long-term memberships. You don't have to vote on that particular provision, but you do need to vote if you want to raise funds locally. And so that's what this section is getting at. What is the new ballot language going to look like? The information that's going to be provided, and we're on page 86. The anticipated statewide education tax rate, and when we come to the December 1 letter, this is going to be made more clear, but that statewide education tax rate can be determined based on knowledge of the adjusted for inflation base amount and the weighted long-term membership. That what you need to know to determine your statewide education tax rate.
Yeah, pick up on the question I asked, that when Sheriff Kornheiser was here, she pointed to you. Can you talk about, is this smooth over 3 years with a rolling average or a 5-year at all?
Yeah. So basically, when July 1, 2029 hits, you're in a foundation formula world. It's just, you're moving from where you were before to this new system. It's why one of the first things Chair Kornheiser said was talking about the transition years. It's something we simply did not talk about in Ways and Means. So what happens between here and now has not been addressed.
we had enough.
Yeah.
So this would be on July 1, 2029, you have this new system, and it's just maybe one thing you're thinking about is when we were looking at the weighting section, we have a hold harmless provision, for instance, that talks about reducing fluctuations, right? It's saying if your pupil counts have decreased dramatically or something along those lines, we want to hold you at 96%. The hold harmless provisions are such that you would be a minimum of 96% of last year's pupil count, essentially, so that you don't have wild fluctuations in your property taxes. Because this contemplates eliminating existing school districts and moving to an entirely new set of school districts, there's nothing to hold harmless. There's no consistent pupil count from what exists today to what exists then. So it's kind of hard to even say right now how you would, but I'm happy to hear.
If I can clarify, so I'm less concerned about the transition point, but I'm more thinking about once this future state is in place.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, would it be smooth as time rolls on? So if there was a major fluctuation in grant list, if something happened, or in pupil count, would that be softened through an average rolling calculation?
There is nothing like that. The thing that I can say about over a 5-year period is that you may be moving to an evidence-based model after a number of years. But I think to your point about smoothing or dampening the effects of exactly trying to account for wild movements, I think the thinking about that is going to go into the school district boundaries themselves. So you'll recall that when, and you could do more. I'm not saying that you couldn't pursue exactly the things that you're talking about. But you'll recall that when Beth was talking about that on page 18, the considerations for the district, the boundaries subcommittee, there were a number of considerations that went into that. And you rightfully pointed to that equalized grand list per pupil and how we didn't have provided, along with the map that would come, the grand list for the districts. The factors that would go into those considerations for setting the school districts could be some of the way of getting at the fluctuations, because if you have relatively stable grand lists across districts, right, if you have relatively reduced variations, and that focus on a minimum of 4,000 pupils or whatever it might be per district, I think that kind of thinking is trying to go into the boundaries, but it may be something to revisit in terms of what is actually in effect. How do you account for fluctuation? And maybe it's as simple as that's what people have to do through supplemental district spending.
And over the years, we have looked at fluctuation in pupils, we've looked at fluctuations in grand lists, because in very small schools, I have a friend who moved and took her 2 daughters out, and they recommended they were half the 3rd and 4th grade class. So that's a huge fluctuation in a very small school. We should eliminate a lot of that now.
And-
But we could, if you had Global Foundries move all its employees, which doesn't happen now as much as it used to with big corporations. But that would put a major reduction, I would assume, in a lot of things, but probably students in the school.
And I think that part of what would be helpful testimony for y'all to receive that's responsive to this is just to know what is the base amount providing, like explicitly, what are the factors captured in that? Because if it truly is just a pure pupil count, then fluctuations that are reflective of the differences in your population shouldn't really matter, but because you would receive the funding that is adequate to the students. But for things outside of the scope of per pupil, like your capital expenditures, your infrastructure and the like, you would want to know because fluctuations there would have more meaningful effect. Just my personal feedback, just thinking about that.
It should. The whole system should smooth that, the likelihood that you're going to have major, that would be an extraordinary event, and we'd probably have to go back and do an extraordinary thing to bail out.
Really raise, because predictability seems to be a
Yeah.
theme, and that might make it more predictable.
This
It's probably small.
makes it more predictable, okay. Senator Gould, all right, Senator Hardy, I wasn't sure.
For me.
Which
Oh,
hands I
Either way,
thought
well, there is a marginal cost per student for when you have a new student or you lose a student that the marginal cost for adding a student to a class is lower than the foundation amount actually. So this was a huge conversation when I did my work in Wisconsin, was the marginal cost of a student. So there's that concept we can think of. In terms of the transition, if we think that these districts and the foundation amount happen simultaneously. So you're right, there's nothing to compare it to say that there's been a change because it's a whole new world. But if we think that these new districts are going to have additional costs in the first few years as they transition into their new world, we could add a small percentage onto the foundation amount. So it's like 101%, 102%, or 105, 104, 103, 102, 101, or something like that of percent of the foundation amount as a way to account for those additional costs. If we were trying to think about like transition costs in the first 5 years of the new school district. I'm not advocating for this necessarily, but just thinking about ways to transition in that way. There are a couple of points that I'm super foggy because my brain, but the other thing is future state. You guys have all adopted saying future state, and I heard the AOE saying it, I've heard legislators saying it, and I've heard the staff saying it, and it's kind of
Orwellian.
Yes, kind of Orwellian to me. And I'm like, oh, can we stop saying future state? But you're all saying it. So I just wanted to hope maybe we don't say future state.
Have something else to determine what it is.
The new world or something. I don't know, but future state sounds so
New world sounds
Like
like the Big Brother kind of.
The other thing I would say on that point is there are multiple future states, so it's also not necessarily that helpful. One is a cost factor future state, and one's an evidence based future state. So it's helpful even just to call out what year we're talking about, and maybe that's what I'll say is in 2029. This is what we're talking about.
Right, and also when you adopt the weights on top of the foundation formula, that actually diminishes the jarring effect of any changes in enrollment because you have so many different weight factors that are attached to students, and so I think it's probably a less of an impact when you lose a student because of the weights definite a little bit. I'm making myself clear. Anyway, go ahead.
Kinda. I don't want to steer us too far from where we are, but does this bill contemplate making healthcare locally negotiable again?
Not that I'm aware of, but that also would not have shown up in my sections. The extent that I am aware of healthcare considerations are in the inflators.
Okay.
But I know that's been a lot of conversation outside of it. I've heard people talk about this, I just don't know where it's going.
And I'm also just curious about salaries, which make up a pretty big portion of spending generally, and now we are, we can negotiate salaries locally in our districts. Is that something that will continue in this?
Oh, no.
Okay, okay. Thanks, sorry, yeah, maybe.
No, I mean, it's good to know what I don't know, because if I don't know, it's probably not in there.
Okay.
But that's,
The governor does have a response to yesterday's event. I was fill out a statement after committee.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't just.
Thank you.
We're multitasking.
I feel very disrespected. So,
I apologize.
Okay.
I don't know. Pretty excited.
so, continue, we're talking about the ballot language, the budget vote for that supplemental district spending. These terms are gonna be more, they won't be familiar yet, or maybe they will, but we haven't gotten to Title 32 yet. But basically what you're seeing here is the ballot language is gonna include things like the definition of supplemental district spending, the long-term membership and the district's per pupil supplemental district spending, and the supplemental district spending yield. And the reason it includes all of these things is if you have all of these pieces, you can determine what rate a school district needs to apply to raise a particular amount of funds. So this is just the information that allows them to do that. And then when they send out, when they present that budget to voters, it would look like this. Shall the voters of the school district approve the school board to expend $5 million, which is the amount that the school board has determined to be necessary in excess of the EOP. So just to note that this is an optional, this is in excess of your EOP. The district, and this will probably be more salient in this room, the district estimates the budget, if approved, to result in X amount of per pupil supplemental district spending. It would give you a comparative factor against the current year's supplemental district spending. But most importantly, it would set out that the supplemental district spending tax rate required to raise that funds is, and it would provide that. So in your ballot, you would see, we're proposing to raise this amount of funds. It's going to take this tax rate across this school district to achieve that.
And it's two.
So it's
Tax
two,
rate
it's two separate rates. It's like there's a
Yeah.
statewide rate and then you have a local rate. So you would,
I think we
and
need to say added to.
the thing I would call it as different is that the statewide rate accounts for the property tax classifications, which Kirby will speak to. So there could be variation depending on the property classification. But for the supplemental district spending tax rate, it's just applied to your district and it's uniform across all kinds of property. It's just a single rate. So it is a rate that you will pay on top of your statewide rate, but it operates differently.
And you don't have to.
And you don't.
But we're gonna have to move this because I've still got Kirby and it is 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, there's no restriction on what they can use it for. It's just.
There's no restriction on that.
10%.
That's right. No restriction. So we'll come,
That can come back, you know.
Do you want to put Kirby on tomorrow at 1:30 before we start the 2 o'clock joint? Okay, yeah, because 1:30 Jen had to cancel. Correct. Can you come back at 1:30 tomorrow? You might get better attention at 1:30 than at 5 o'clock.
It's not always
Get lunch
Yeah.
here.
So, you know.
Okay, John, you can just take your time then.
I was getting so excited to rush. Okay, we have a set of repeals here. This is just pulling out pieces that are tied to our existing education funding section. I talked before about the unorganized housing force, so these are technical provisions that are now superfluous. Your excess spending penalty, hold harmless provisions, those are part of your existing system. You don't need them now. And then this was the question earlier. This is the repeal of the census block grant for special education. So more substantive in your subsection C, and that's tied to replacing that census block grant with the weights that we saw. And that's Title 16, Section 4010. Section 43 is the creation of your supplemental district spending reserve. This is within the ed fund and any recapture, which we'll talk about shortly, but basically any extra funds that a district raises through the application of an equalized rate would be reserved within this supplemental district spending reserve. Subsection B tells you what that, the first use of that recapture would be. So in a fiscal year, the amounts raised through those local taxes was insufficient to cover payment to each school district of its supplemental district spending. You would use the reserve to offset that deficit. So if you've miscalculated basically, or the figures are slightly off, you could use the reserve to offset that miscalculation. And then more serious, I mean, more salient to think about, I guess, is subsection C. So any funds remaining after you've done that, addressing miscalculations and the like, would be transferred into the school construction aid special fund. So there's a special fund created for school construction, and your recapture, your excess funds raised would flow into at the end of the fiscal year. That special fund should be used to help address school construction projects across the state. But I would note there still has not been found a source to fund the school construction.
We're not going to build much with what's being transferred here.
77 million that we're putting toward.
Paying down the.
Yeah, if you could put that into a special fund for school construction.
And that's general fund money. I don't think we can do that.
Well, actually, some of it is edge fund.
Now, 42 is is excess revenue in the ed fund. It got figured into that 5% increase already in the December 1st letter. So no, that 77 million.
Okay, I thought it was a good idea.
Yeah, no, we could do it, but I think they're gonna need it over there to make sure some of these people get health care or other things that are vital as education.
Well, there,
Yes.
with the recapture rate you're about to explain, I do think that there is a way that if we did lower that 15,033 foundation amount to a lower amount, then the districts with a higher grant list, when they raise money, would feed more money into the school construction aid because of the grant. They're calling it supplemental distribution reserve. I'd call it a grant list adjustment.
But then it would create more inequities in the system, because the school districts that cannot patch a budget to go above the amount would have a lower foundation amount. That would be, it would be, right now, the 15,033 is based on actual research.
When we have the
lower amount,
number crunches.
that's a court case right there.
We will have this discussion. Right now, I just want to get through the words.
Yep.
And we will have Julia in here when it's tomorrow. We've given her one whole day off. And we will go over the numbers, and then if ideas come up, when we have the people that can crunch the numbers, we will send them off to crunch them. Crunch. That's right.
So we're coming up to a set of reports. So AOE section 44, December 15th of this year, to submit a written report to committees of jurisdiction, including you guys, on clear and equitable guidelines for minimum transportation to be provided and covered by transportation reimbursement grants. So this was something that Rep. Kornheiser was talking about, is that we have these sets of reports. Transportation is not something that was this year beyond setting up study.
Problem I remember from something last week is that not all schools provide transportation. And there was a Tammy Colby. So that's why there's not like a wait for transportation.
And it will be affected by the district boundaries. I mean, that's the thing, is a lot of this is just, we are talking about the education finance system separate from the education policy. We're talking about it separate from the school district boundaries, but being real, they all have to be talked about together. This is just sort of the way that jurisdictions work, that you have to talk about pieces at a time. And I will say, conceptually, you can talk about the system without talking about this thing, but it informs the pieces here. So the supplemental district spending, for instance, is dramatically affected by what your picture of the school districts is. So,
And, Montpelier does not provide transportation above elementary school. And it is located downtown. I would not suggest anyone try and drive in front of the middle school between 2:30 and 3 o'clock on any afternoon, because 90% of the parents are there picking their kids up. I don't know. In the sense of other values like air quality, if we're winning. But everyone was.
Section 45 is a set of 2 reports from JFO, same date, December 15th of this year. The first is that inflationary measure study that I've been mentioning so many times. It would specifically look at that NEPA or NIPA deflator that is existing in Title 16, but also look at alternative inflationary measures and would analyze options and provide considerations for selecting an inflationary measure appropriate to Vermont's education funding system. Again, just to state, this line, while it sounds vague, is significant, appropriate to the education funding system, and this is meant to get at what kind of costs do you guys want captured in this? Is healthcare costs part of what you want captured, for instance, in your inflators that apply to your facing them? Separately, JFO is meant to come back same date, same committees of jurisdiction on with a report on the current funding systems for pre-K, the child care financial assistance program, or any other early care and learning systems, to review financial incentives in these systems and to provide considerations for changing the funding streams associated with these early care and learning systems to align with the education transformation initiative. I will just say, I don't know anything about pre-K and I didn't grab this section. So if you have questions, I'm not going to be very helpful. I can try to. Okay, so now we are jumping to Title 32, which is kind of core stuff for you guys. The what you saw above is setting out that foundation formula, so those concepts matter. But now we're talking about the education property tax rate formula, and I'll again high level overview of what the next sections go over. So this amends your chapter 135 in Title 32, which is your education property tax chapter, to repeal the concepts that are required exclusively for our current education funding system. So that's things like excess spending penalty, the yields, the adjustments that you see, and creates a new supplemental district spending concept to allow school districts to raise amounts above their EOP at an equalized rate for their district. It imposes a statewide education tax on 4 tax classifications of property, which Kirby will talk about in more detail, for expenditures in the ed fund other than the supplemental district spending, and imposes a separate supplemental district spending tax, which is what we were talking about when we talked about the ballot language, be raised locally for that district at an equalized rate.
Okay.
It updates the December 1 letter to include recommendations for the statewide rate, which, as discussed before, could be determined based on the inflation adjusted base and the school district's weighted long-term memberships. The December 1 letter would also include recommendations for the supplemental district spending yield, which I will talk about in more detail shortly, but it's the concept
About
of.
to lose half my.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we're trying to cut this off, I can finish my overview and maybe we can stop there or.
Yeah, I think we'll
Not have the committee.
no.
Like,
When the,
Oh.
when I got told this, my Democrats were not in the room, but I suggested we could just approve this while they were gone.
You can keep going. Yeah. I'll read about it in bigger.
Okay.
That's basically the overview of the section. So that's an actual stop. Yeah.
Okay. And Kirby, we'll have you back, and these are the sections that we're going to really be working on.
Yeah.
That,
And as for my sections, really the next 2 sections are the core ones of the block conforming changes, and beyond that, we can talk about the property tax credit repeal and the homestead exemption, but those are things that are also easy to talk about without the legislative language. Like the
Yeah.
concept can be talked about in a way where we don't have to go through all of the conforming changes, which are tens and tens of
yes,
pages.
tens of pages of just crossing things out.
Exactly. And people say, why do you do this?
If we can agree on the concept, you guys can write it, right? All we have to do is agree. Okay, so we will walk through the rest of this, and John, if you can come back, we can finish yours up tomorrow. And then we are meeting jointly with Senate Education, and we've got Julia Richter, Chris Rube, Ezra Holden, and Beth St. James again, to walk us through the transforming. So they're going to go through the finance part. So you'll probably be better off over here tomorrow. When they're talking about the numbers.
Did you want to sequence it such that we finish the walkthrough before JFO begins? It's kind of.
Yeah, I think we'll finish the walkthrough and then we'll.
What time?
We'll have JFO. At 1:30, at 1:30. And
And,
we've
and
got them on at 2. Can you do it in a half an
Oh,
hour?
both of us?
Both of you?
you can't do it in that.
That would be tight.
How about just you?
Sure.
Can we do that? And then we'll have you back the same as Beth.
I'm good whenever, and I can
Yeah.
be in here too. If it's helpful.
Okay.
I'll bring all somehow tomorrow.
You can also, since my stuff's less connected with Beth and John, if you want to let John
Set
finish,
a ball in the way.
since it's on your mind right now, and just push me back to even later, I think that
Okay.
could be workable.
Maybe we'll do that, and if we finish them by like 3:30, we could have you come on then. Would that work
Sure.
for you?
Yeah.
Okay,
That
so
sounds
we'll
good.
have you on at 1:30.
Okay, cool.
And we're on the floor at 1, so I can't push that back. I don't
Just tell
think
them,
we
you
have much of anything on
We've got
the floor,
important stuff to do.
but I can't push you back to 1:00. Not tomorrow. Not yet.
I was gonna say, I've been using my excuses a lot lately. I feel like I've been asked if that's fine stuff. I'm like, no, sorry, there's a lot happening.
It's a lot happening.
Do we need to be live to have this conversation?
We are live.
I know, but I mean, we don't need to. We're just talking
Oh, no,
about scheduling.
We can adjourn. This is